In this video, we will talk about acronym INVEST, how we can use it in Scrum and Agile. We turn our attention to create good user stories and focus on 6 attributes. However, INVEST criteria relates not only to user stories. The INVEST criteria for Agile was created by Bill Wake as a reminder of the characteristics of a good quality product backlog item, commonly written in user story format, but not required to be. Such product backlog item may be used in a Scrum or Kanban backlog or in XP project. So, a good story is I, independent, N, negotiable, V, valuable, E, estimable, S, small, T, testable. Let's talk about all these letters. First is I, independent. As much as possible, care should be taken to avoid introducing dependencies between stories. Dependencies between stories lead to prioritization and planning problems. For example, suppose the customer has selected as a high priority a story that is dependent on a story that is low priority. Dependencies between stories can also make estimation much harder than it needs to be. Combine the dependent stories into one larger but independent story. Find a different way of splitting the stories. If you don't want to combine the stories and can't find a good way to split them, you can always take the simple approach of putting 2 estimates on the card. One estimate if the story is done before the other story, a lower estimate if it is done after. Number 2, N, negotiable. Stories are negotiable. They are not written contracts or requirements that the software must implement. Story cards are short descriptions of functionality, the details of which are to be negotiated in conversation between the customers and developers. Because story cards are reminders to have a conversation rather than fully detailed requirements themselves, they do not need to include all relevant details. However, if at the time the story is written some important details are known, they should be included as annotations to the story card. The challenge comes in learning to include just enough detail. When a developer starts to code this story, he or she will be reminded that a decision has already been made to accept the 3 main cards, and he or she can ask the customer if a decision has been made about accepting discover cards. The notes on the card help a developer and the customer to resume a conversation where it left off previously. Ideally, the conversation can be resumed this easily regardless of whether it is the same developer and customer who resume the conversation. Use this as a guideline when adding detail to stories. On the other hand, consider a story that is annotated with too many notes. This story has too much detail and also combines what should probably be a separate story. Most readers of this type of story will mistakenly associate the extra detail with extra precision. However, in many cases, specifying details too soon just creates more work. There are too many missing details for them to mistakenly view their discussion as definitive or their estimate as accurate. Details that have already been determined through conversations become tests. Tests can be noted on the back of the story card if using note card or in whatever electronic system is being used. Number 3, V, valuable. It is tempting to say something along the lines of each story must be valued by the users, but that would be wrong. In many projects include stories that are not valued by users, keeping in mind the distinction between the user, someone who uses the software, and the purchaser, someone who purchases the software. Suppose developers are building software that will be deployed across a large user base. perhaps 5,000 computers in a single company, for example, yes? The purchaser of a product like that may be very concerned that each of the 5,000 computers is using the same configuration for the software. This may lead to a story like all configuration information is read from a central location. Users don't care where configuration information is stored, but purchasers might. The best way to ensure that each story is valuable to the customer or users is to have the customer write the stories. Customers are often uncomfortable with this initially, probably because developers have trained them to think of everything they write as something that can be held against them later. Most customers begin writing stories themselves once they become comfortable with the concept that story cards are reminders to talk later rather than formal commitments or descriptions of specific functionality. Letter 4. Estimable. It is important for developers to be able to estimate, or at least take a guess at, the size of a story, of the amount of time it will take to turn a story into working code. There are 3 common reasons why a story may not be estimatable. Developers lack domain knowledge, developers lack technical knowledge, the story is too big. If the developers do not understand a story as it's written, they should discuss it with the customer who wrote the story. Again, it is not necessary to understand all the details about a story, but developers need to have a general understanding of the story. Second, a story may not be estimatable because the developers do not understand the technology involved. Finally, the developers may not be able to estimate a story if it is too big. For example, the story, just for example, a job seeker can find a job, is too large. In order to estimate it, the developers will need to disaggregate it into smaller constituent stories. Next letter is S, small. Some stories can be too big, some can be too small, and some can be just right. Story size does matter because if stories are too large or too small, you cannot use them in planning. Epics are difficult to work with because they frequently contain multiple stories. The epic should be split into smaller stories. The ultimate determination of whether a story is appropriately sized is based on the team, its capabilities, and the technologies in use. And the last letter, T, testable. Stories must be written so as to be testable. Successfully passing its test proves that a story has been successfully developed. If the story cannot be tested, how can the developers know when they have finished coding? Untestable stories commonly show up for non-functional requirements, which are requirements about the software but not directly about its functionality. Whenever possible, tests should be automated. This means strive for 99% automation, not 10%. You can almost always automate more than you think you can. When a product is developed incrementally, things can change very quickly, and code that worked yesterday can stop working today. You want automated tests that will find this as soon as possible. There is a very small subset of tests that cannot be realistically be automated. That type of test can be both time-consuming and expensive, but the story is testable and may be appropriate for some products. The story, a user never has to wait long for any screen to appear, is not testable because it says never and because it does not define what wait long means. Demonstrating that something never happens is impossible. A far easier and more reasonable target is to demonstrate that something rarely happens. This story could have instead been written as a new screens appear within 2 seconds in 95% of all cases. And even better, an automated test can be written to verify this. So let's summarize all about acronym INVEST. Ideally, stories are independent from one another. This isn't always possible, but to the extent it is, stories should be written so that they can be developed in any order. The details of a story are negotiated between the user and developers. Stories should be written so that their value to users or the customer is clear. The best way to achieve this is to have the customer write the stories. Stories may be annotated with details, but too much detail obscures the meaning of the story and can give the impression that no conversation is necessary between the developers and the customer. One of the best ways to annotate a story is to write test cases for the story. If they are too big, compound and complex stories may be split into multiple smaller stories. If they are too small, multiple tiny stories may be combined into one bigger story. Stories need to be testable. So we have completed our topic about INVEST criteria. And if you like this video, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel right now. Just click on the subscribe button below this video and also to like button. It's really important to promote this video. Now I want to turn it over to you. Will you use INVEST criteria in your practice or not? Either way, let me know by leaving a comment below right now.